All right, we're going to start in Psalm 137. A few weeks ago, I was reading in the New York Post. I read the New York Post almost every day, all the way from top to bottom. It's my favorite newspaper. And the story came out of, I think it was Brooklyn or Queens, that two neighbors in a condo complex or townhome complex got into a fight. They've been neighbors for years, and the one neighbor shot to death the dad and the grown son of the people who lived right below him. He went down with a gun. They've been having this dispute for years that the other family was too loud. In fact, he shot the son to death. He'd already shot the dad. He came back to the dad and shot him execution style. And then he went on the run. They caught him, and he's now in jail. And I was reading that, and as I was reading the story, it kept running through my mind what Robert Frost wrote years ago in New England. He wrote, "Good fences make good neighbors." Something there is that doesn't love a wall. You may know the poem. It's excellent. If you haven't read it, you need to read it. It's really good. I love Robert Frost. In fact, if you go into my office, I have different things on my wall, but the only thing that I have that's truly secular, other than pictures, I have a poem by Frost my sister-in-law did for me for Christmas one year. My favorite poem that he wrote, "O Star," and it's an excellent poem. It's been put to music. I remember singing it in high school in our choir, and I love the poem, and hence it's in my office. You might know Frost because he wrote a poem that's famous, very famous, called "Two Roads Diverged in a Yellow Wood," and he talks about how there's two paths in life, and the one was less traveled by, and he says, "I took that path, and that made all the difference." But if you think about the way Frost says that, I think Frost is really presenting what's called, in logical fallacies, it's called a false dichotomy or a false dilemma. It's the idea that there's one choice or another, but no other choices to be had. So Frost says there are two roads. I took one road. I could have taken the other road. But in life, it doesn't really work that way. I mean, I was dating a girl when I just met Becky. We were not dating at the time, but I was dating this other girl, and she was beautiful and talented and fun, but she was an unbeliever. And I know now, I didn't really think about it as much then, but I know now she was an unbeliever. I hope that since that time she's come to know the Lord, but she was clearly an unbeliever then. And I sat through a class, and I was sitting in this class, and the professor was teaching about being a pastor, and he said, probably the most important thing for a pastor is his wife, and if you get the wrong wife as a pastor, it's going to destroy your ministry. And the whole time I'm sitting there, I'm thinking about the girl that I'm dating. I said, this is not going to work. And so that Friday night, we were together and we're walking around the track at our school watching a soccer game go on. And I'm saying to her, it's not you, it's me, but really it's you, It's just clearly not God's will that I ever talk to you ever again. And, that fun conversation you have when you break up with somebody. And it was just weeks later that I started dating my wife. And you think about the opportunities there, that would have been a big difference, right? But that's not the only road I went down. There's lots of roads in life. And you choose one road, and then you have new choices, and you choose another road. When we moved here, this was one choice of about 3 or 4 that we were looking at. We were thinking about planting a church in Wilmington, Delaware. I was thinking about Austin, Texas. I was even thinking about San Jose, California, but from a carnal standpoint, just because the weather's so nice. No other reason than that, I can honestly say. But how different life would have been if 22 years ago we had decided to go somewhere else. Our lives would be different. Your lives would be different, at least in some way. You'd probably be happy here. No, I'm kidding. But a false dichotomy is a logical fallacy because it presents an either-or scenario, leaving out the possibility that there can be alternative choices. So this happens in politics all the time. People say a vote for that candidate is really a vote against this candidate. Or if you don't vote for this person, you're really voting for that person. That's a false dichotomy. And sometimes this fallacy, like I said, is called a false dilemma. So they say you can't believe in science and Christianity. You can't be an introvert and an extrovert. You can't be with me and against me. And they put it that way because they're always trying to force you into a decision that you may not want to make. In other words, it's like you're standing looking at frosty roads and somebody's saying, you can either go that way or you have to go this way. When in reality, there may be other alternatives. And in the human existence, this is almost always the case. But in Christianity, God sets up either or situations all the time that are not false dichotomies. What did Jesus say about himself? I am the way. You can't look and say, well, I can go the Hindu way, or I can go the way of Mormonism or Jehovah's Witness or Catholicism. You can't choose one of the other ways. You either follow Jesus or you don't. You either go to a place called heaven in the intermediate state. If you died this afternoon, you would either go to heaven or you would go to a place called hell. And you would really, tangibly be in one of those two places. That's not a false dichotomy. You don't have any other room to go somewhere else. And so in the gospel of Jesus, we have choices. You can choose to follow him, believe in him, and obey him as your Lord and Master, or you can reject him. And so when you get to the book of Romans, you find Paul setting forth an argument that kind of does lead you to that conclusion. And Paul begins in the first chapter by explaining that the whole world is under the wrath of God. The wrath of God is revealed. And the righteousness of God is being revealed in his wrath against sin. And he explains in chapter 1 how sinful man is. And then, of course, the Jewish objection to that would have been, but we're good. And he says, no, who are you? You judge all of these Gentiles, all of these other people, but you're just as sinful. And chapter 2 says God is going to judge all of us by his gospel. He's an impartial judge. He's fair and he's true. And it will be by the gospel. And so by the time you get to chapter 3, we have that long section about how mankind really is. There is no one who is righteous, not one person. God is righteous, but man is unrighteous. And he goes through this list. His mouth is an open sepulcher. His feet pursue evil. And you read through that list all the way to the incredible concluding statement that he makes in chapter 3, verses 23 and 24 and 25 and 26, where he says that, but God saves people to show that he's righteous, and he does it because of Jesus. And chapters 4 and 5 show us that this salvation is by grace through faith alone. And so you get to the beginning of chapter 5 and you find that we have peace with God, that we've been declared righteous, even though we are still sinful. And Paul ends chapter 5 with this great, incredible statement where he says, where sin abounded, grace superabounded. That no matter how great our sin is, grace is always greater than sin. And to explain how that works, because the natural objection would be, well, then I can do whatever I want. He says, no, it doesn't work like that. And he explains in chapter 6 what sin actually brings. And he concludes, as we just heard a moment ago, that sin always brings death and Jesus always brings life. Now, if you take that idea and understand that that is a universal concept, and you apply it to the Old Testament, particularly to God's people Israel, you see it play itself out. God rescued Israel out of Egypt and took them to a promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. That is a land of great agriculture, of great plenty. But the people wanted to be like the nations around them. And they wanted a king like the other nations. And worse, they started to follow the idols of the other nations. They began to bow down to the gods like Molech. They began to practice human sacrifice, even in some cases. During the reign of Manasseh, they practiced idolatry, and they destroyed their own nation because God had promised them at the end of Deuteronomy, when you turn away from me, I will reject you and send you into captivity. And so, in the time of Jeremiah and Daniel, around that time, God brought a nation, a great nation, the Babylonians, to take them captive. Understand that many of the tribes of Israel, out of the 12, 10 of them had already been destroyed by the Assyrians. But now Jerusalem was under assault. The temple was destroyed. The people were being taken captive, and they're taken to Babylon. And as we reflected before on someone living in the captivity, it looks like the covenant of God had been broken because it is so awful. And that's kind of where we're at in this psalm, in Psalm 137. But what's interesting is that then you go back to Psalm 126. I believe it is Psalm 126. And you find there the end of the captivity. And so you really have in the Old Testament kind of being played for us again, the idea that the wages of sin is death, but the grace, the gift, the grace of God is life. And this is something we find true whether they're the old or the new. So let's begin with the number one, the wages of sin is death. And here in Psalm 137, we find that sin has life-changing consequences. Tell me these people did not envision this for themselves. You sit down with an employer, a new future employer, and the human resources director says to you, where do you see yourselves in 5 years? And you're in ancient Israel, and you say, well, I see our city destroyed. I see the walls torn down, the temple burned, and my family, well, my dad's going to be murdered. My mom is going to be a slave in somebody's house and treated horribly. And my sister and I, we're going to be slaves for the rest of our natural lives. That's where I see myself in 5 years. Nobody would do that, right? This is a life-changing situation for these people. And here they are being taken to Babylon, and they're now by the Euphrates River, perhaps, the rivers of Babylon, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and they're sitting down and they're weeping. And you can imagine the long walk from Jerusalem to Babylon, and all the way they are weeping and they're crying and they're suffering. And now they're being taken captive. And they take their musical instruments in verse 2 and they hang it on the branches of the trees around them. All the while, their heathen captors are saying, sing us a song. You see, sin takes us captive and it makes us incapable of doing what we're supposed to do. God's people were supposed to worship Him, but now they say we can't worship Him. We're emotionally drained. We're sitting down and we're weeping. We have no mirth, no joy. And in fact, we hang our musical instrument on the branches and refuse to sing because our lives have been changed so drastically by sin. Sin not only changes our lives with life-changing consequences, it destroys our joy. Listen, sin is a joy thief. It steals it. It may seem good at the moment, but it robs you of your joy. It says in verse 4, how will we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? He says, I can't do it. I lose my capacity to rejoice in God. He says, I can't sing God's songs in a foreign country. There's no way I can worship God as I should in this condition. In fact, there's a longing that's here. This person offers up oaths. I will not play my instruments. I will not sing to God. My tongue will be fastened to the roof of my mouth. It will be stuck to my hard palate. I can't sing because I long for Jerusalem. I long for the temple. I long for the joy. If you remember the story, when they get back to Jerusalem, the remnant returns and they rebuild a temple. There were some old men there who were boys when they left, who take off their hats and they weep, not for the joy of the temple. And all these young people are cheering and rejoicing because of what God has done in rebuilding a temple. But those old men knew it's nothing like what we had before. Their joy was gone, stolen by sin. And it leaves you feeling bitter. Remember, O Lord, the children of Edom. These are hard sentences to read. I'm just going to tell you, this is hard to read. Verses 7 through 9 are some of the hardest to read in our Bibles. God repay the Edomites. These are the Ishmaelites. You see, when we're in pain, sometimes that causes us to hate other people. And apparently the Edomites, the descendants of Israel, had joined in the plunder of Jerusalem, and they were hated by Israel. So this man is actually praying, think about this, praying for God to send divine retribution on the Edomites. But it gets worse. We become people who enjoy the hurt of others. Of the Babylonians who were brutal. The women had been ravished. The fighting aged men had been murdered by the sword. Their children had been enslaved. But if they were infants and they couldn't be taken back to Babylon, they were just killed. And you can think as a person who had just suffered the complete breakdown of your society, the complete loss of your system of worship, and now you are actually a captive, and your life is effectively over the way we think about it now, and your infant child has just been murdered in front of your eyes. How bitter do you feel? And notice what he says, I can't wait for the day when somebody does to you what you just did to me. In fact, I've often, it's not a joking matter the way the Psalm's written, it's horrible. But I've often, just not to be so sad in reading this, said to myself, sometimes churches buy, they call them psalmnals, right? It's a hymnal, but it's all the Psalms. How do you sing this one? Let's all stand to our feet and sing, happy is he that dasheth thy little ones. I mean, how do you sing this? There's nothing happy here. This is where sin leaves you. God's people, Isaiah said, they were like a sick body from the head, the top of their head, to the bottoms, the soles of their feet. They were sick. There were open wounds. That's the picture that Isaiah gives. There's nothing healthy in the body. The body is completely dead. And Isaiah is warning them, you are going to suffer in captivity because of your sin. And you get to Jeremiah, and now you know why he's the weeping prophet. Because Jeremiah is actually watching all this play out in front of him. And as you see this kind of weeping and this kind of anguish, you know this is what sin does. If God's people had been living right, this would not have happened to them. This was what their sin brought them. Their sin changed their lives in a way that was no going back. Those children would live 70-some years in captivity. Daniel, as a young man taken from his home, would go, his name would be changed. He would be put into a training program, and he would become effectively the advisor to a pagan king. His friends would be thrown into a fiery furnace because of their refusal to worship that king. And then in the middle of all that, while he is in effect the third highest ranking officer in the land, that nation would be overthrown by another pagan nation. And he would be taken captive to that nation. And as an old man, he'd finally read in the scroll of Jeremiah that there would be a 70-year captivity. And he begins counting back. And if you take the first raid of Babylon on Jerusalem, or the second raid, or the third raid, now Daniel is praying like this, oh Lord, let the 70 years start at the first raid. I pray that the clock began then. And you think about Daniel's life. He didn't grow up like he would have. Family, going to temple. He was part of the royal family, we believe. All that would have been Daniel's, he didn't have. And he was godly. He loved the Lord. He was thrown into a den of lions because he refused not to pray to God. He's a godly man. He refused the portion of the king's meat as a teenager to say, no, I won't do this, even if it means my life. He's godly, and yet he's suffering because of the sin of Israel. Sin has life-changing consequences. Sin takes away your joy, and it leaves you feeling bitter. There's nothing good about it. Sin is ruining marriages. In Christian, Bible-preaching churches, Sin is ruining marriages. Sin is destroying families. Sin is wrecking testimonies. Sin is undermining the gospel witness. Sin is warping Christian character. It's encouraging more sin. It's tearing apart friendships, and it's closing churches. That's what sin does. There's nothing good about it. There's nothing good about lies. There's nothing good about laziness. There's nothing good about anger. There's nothing good about pride. There's nothing good about jealousy. There's nothing good about hatred. There's nothing good about adultery. Sin is destroying people. Can we just stop and say Paul was right? The wages of sin is death. Now, if you're an unbeliever here and you don't know Jesus Christ, you are spiritually dead. And right now, you are heaping up to yourself the judgment of God, the eternal judgment of God, your own damnation. Did you hear the word I just used? It's not a word we use very often in polite society. You are heaping to yourself the wrath of God in your own damnation. The wages of sin is death. If you're a believer, what does sin bring into a believer's life? Yes, you have eternal salvation. That's true. But as you sin, do you know what you're introducing into your life? You're introducing death into your life. You husbands, listen to me, husbands. When you sin against your family, against your wife, you're bringing death into your family. You are killing them. Ladies, wives, listen to me. When you bring sin into your homes, you are bringing death to your own children. You are killing them. Sin brings death. We all have to just stop and realize that's what he's saying. And it would be foolish for us to say, well, he's only talking about eternal salvation here. No, sin brings death. Sin is death. James said it. Lust, when it's conceived, brings forth sin. And sin, when it is finished, brings forth death. Sin is death. And someday, when they lay my dead body in the ground, may we all who are there, maybe some of you will be there, acknowledge the reason his body's in the ground is because he was a sinner. It's death. Now you know why I decided not to end the sermon on that. How awful would that have been? Because we can rejoice. Because even though sin brings death, what? Wait, thanks be to God for giving us grace to overcome our sin. The grace of God brings life. That's the gift. The gift of God is life. And let's go back to Psalm 126. Because God's grace gives us cause to rejoice. Even though we have death and we have this sentence of death upon us, even in a physical sense, that's permanent. That doesn't change. But in a spiritual sense, we now have life. And God's grace gives us cause to rejoice. When the Lord turned again the captivity of Zion, we were like them that dream. Our mouth was filled with laughter. Our tongue was singing. Do you see how opposite this is to the earlier psalm? I can't sing. I'm going to put my instruments on the trees. My tongue will fasten itself to the roof of my mouth. Now they're running around. Can you believe it? Can you believe where we are? Can you imagine have ever being back here? Look where we are. It's like a dream. It's like a fantasy. It can't possibly be real. It's so incredible. Our mouths were filled with laughter. Our tongues was singing. If they walked with heavy hearts to Babylon, they skip all the way back to Jerusalem. I mean, it's all the kids have drawn out all those little squares on the sidewalk, and they're doing the whole hopscotch thing all the way back. Some of them are sashaying, some are jazz hands. I mean, it's fun. This is awesome. I can't believe this. We're going home. God has returned us home. Restoration is so amazing that it overwhelms us. Some people think maybe this psalm is dealing with some other time of restoration in Israel, but I do believe it was written and applies to the restoration when God ended the captivity of Israel, first from Babylon, then from Persia, as they are going home. And that's what makes this story so amazing. Do you realize how they got home? It wasn't because they defeated Cyrus. If you read up in Daniel, you know that the animals that are represented there, the lion was Nebuchadnezzar, and the bear was Persia, and the leopard is Greece, and the monstrous beast is Rome. And I do believe that is how that section applies. When you read the book of Daniel, do you notice there's not a king of Israel mentioned there? It's not like this great king arose and overthrew one of those nations and became powerful over the whole earth. That will come because there's a rock that will arise and will destroy all the other nations. That's Jesus. But we don't have that happening yet. And so it isn't like they said to Cyrus, hey, Cyrus, listen, I know you're a really powerful king, and I know you're the bear in Daniel's book. But we're pretty powerful too, and if you don't let us go, we're going to take you out. It's not like that. In fact, there's a story that's really incredible that when the leopard, who is Alexander the Great, it's Greece, when Alexander is really quickly moving through the Middle East and taking everything as his possession, he comes up to a Jewish town and he's going to take the town. And he's going to do as he does. If you surrender to me, you live. If you don't, everybody dies. That's kind of Alexander's way. And Alexander's armies are there. And the priest comes out of the town. Can you imagine, out of the walls? Here comes this lone priest. Here's the pastor with, his scroll under his arm. I'm armed with the Bible, and I'm going to take down this army. And he walks out there and he opens the scroll and says, here, that's you. Did you know our God talks about you? That's you. And Alexander is so mesmerized by the fact that he's in their Bible that he doesn't take the town. He says, you guys can just go ahead and go what you do. We're going to go to the next town. I mean, this situation is so amazing. It's not because they were powerful. It's just because God did it. He told Cyrus, you send them back. And Cyrus sent them back. And so they are like those who dreamed. This is something that's so amazing, this restoration. And now, do you notice, I can't sing, but now they are singing. And before, sing us a song. And how can we sing a song? And now it's, you don't ask me to sing a song. You're going to tell me we'd like to stop hearing your song, right? Because the heathen are saying, the Lord hath done great things for them. That's what the heathen were saying. It's incredible because now we have unbelievers actually seeing the testimony of God in the lives of these people and saying, look what God has done for them. When there is life, when there is God working and Christ working in the life and the Holy Spirit of God leading you, there's life, and that life causes others to say, look, life around is bad, but that is a bright spot because that family, because that man, because that woman, because of those kids, they are showing forth the light of Jesus. And what has God done for them? It's amazing. That's what God's grace does. Men and women, God's grace, letter B, gives us hope for continued renewal. Now, if you know anything about the way the captivity went, they get back and it's rubble. I mean, I thought somebody would have cleaned this up in the 70 years. What happened to the cleaning crews? Well, they were just trying to survive. They were the poorest of the poor. And nobody cleaned it up. 70 years goes by and their city is just rubble. They have no temple. They have no walls. And now you've got Ezra and Nehemiah. You've got these stories of people coming back, and Haggai coming back to rebuild. They're going to build the temple of God, and they're going to build the walls of Jerusalem. But everything's destroyed. You go out into the fields around Jerusalem, and they're destroyed. You go to the olive groves on the mountain next to Jerusalem, and it's destroyed. Everything's gone. Everything's lost and ruined. And what's actually happening here is they're saying, here we are, Lord. Okay, it's great that we got back, but now I'm looking for the future time when all of this is restored to what it was before. So the first part is, I can't believe we're not slaves anymore. I can't believe we've been freed. I can't believe we're going back to Jerusalem. This is wonderful. But they arrive and everything's bad. And notice what the prayer is. Okay, in verse 4, turn again our captivity, O Lord, as streams in the south. Only God can make water flow in the desert. You go down to the Negev in the southern part of Israel, and you have what's called wadis. And these wadis are like two mountainous regions, not necessarily super tall, but they have these hill regions. And then there's a valley, and they're really close together, and that valley is really compact. And normally it's desert, but when it rains really hard in the north, that water flows down, and all of a sudden that those places that are dry as desert become rivers. If you went with us to Utah on a missions trip a number of years ago, we went on a hike. That's my favorite hike I've ever been on, because it's a place called the Narrows. And you walk through those Narrows, and you walk on this path. It's about a half a mile, and then the next step is into water. And the hike is literally through water. And about partway, not far into the hike, you're up to your waist in water, and then you keep hiking, and you're up to your chest in water. The kids are all swimming. And that's the hike. And it's just a few miles up, and you turn around and come back. And that's the hike. And it was so much fun. We were really enjoying ourselves and feeling guilty that it was a mission trip. Well, we are vacationaries when we go anyway. We were having so much fun. And just a few years ago, I read a story of a couple that went into the Narrows. And as soon as I'm reading, I'm going, oh, I know where that is. I've been there. They walked into the Narrows, and they went at the wrong time of year. And the snows were melting, and the rivers rose very quickly and swept them away to their deaths. That's the streams in the south. Only God can make water run in the desert. And though you have desert in your life because of sin, God brings water of life to flood you with joy. And so the prayer is, okay, Lord, make us like the overflowing wadis in the south of Israel, in the Negev. Make us like those overflowing wadis. Make us like the streams in the south. Only God can make water flow in the desert. Only God can turn weeping into laughing. And here we have an agricultural statement. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. This is the problem. In Israel, the crops are all destroyed. And you see these farmers now. They're going out and they're having to rip out all the weeds. They're having to reestablish the farms. It's a lot of work, and I'm sure lots of tears. This is, by the way, has nothing to do with soul winning. This passage has been horribly, horribly abused by preachers who have no idea what they're talking about. And I mean that. If you try to make this soul winning, you're abusing the text. That's not what it means. And I know there's Bearing Precious Seeds ministry and all that, okay? They're abusing the text. That's not what it means. And some of you are going to say, this is another one of those moments Pastor is saying something I didn't know, or ripping the rug out from underneath me because that's what I thought it always was. It's not what it means. What is he saying? He's saying, look, these people, they're going back to their lands. They have their seed in their hand, and it's rough and it's hard, and they have to go back. But what happens after they plant the seed? What happens after they fix the farm? They reap in joy. And they come back with the bundles of grain under their arms or over their shoulders. Just like when Joshua sent the spies into Canaan, originally there were the long branches of grapes they would bring back on their shoulders. All of the incredible things that were in the land, that had all been wrecked. In 70 years, the land was fallow and nothing's growing. But now it's all being restored. And those who were taking their seed in their hand were planting it in the ground. And now they can come back and say, look what God has done. And so even while God's grace gives us cause to rejoice in the moment, it gives us hope, ladies and gentlemen, that God will do more for us in the future. That there's greater blessing as we obey Him. There's greater joys to be had as we follow Him. And as we actually take step by step to walk after Jesus, to take His cross upon us and to bear it up. As horrible as that sounds, God gives blessing. What does He say to Peter when Peter says, okay, Lord, you say this is really hard to do, but we left houses and lands for your sake. And he says to Peter, no man has left houses and mother and father and lands and all of this for my sake, that it won't be returned to him many times over again. And he's talking about in this life. And let me tell you what that really is, I think Jesus is talking about. He's referring to the church itself. One of the blessings I had when I joined the pastor band as a young man, I was doing an internship in Indiana, rural Indiana, and I was 24 years old. And you know what I had in that church? I had a whole bunch of moms. My mom was in South Carolina, nowhere near where I was. Here I am, a single young man. Did you know that there was all these ladies, and they would say, just call me mom. I was there. They just took me under their wing. They would have me over for lunch. I only had 2 meals a day. That's all I was able to afford to eat. So I was eating 2 meals a day. And then I had all these moms in the church, and they would bring me over on Sunday, and they would give me jobs to do, even though I really wasn't capable of doing them. And they would pay me lots of money. And it's just ridiculous. But it was so I could buy food to eat. And then I would take the teenagers of the church out, and we'd all go for shave ice, and I'd spend half the money on feeding all the teenagers shave ice. That's a wise decision, right? My car is barely running, but we've got all the shave ice in town. It was awesome. And God gives you more than you need, and more than you can even want if your wanter isn't broken. And you look at life, listen, the grace of God gives life. I'm not talking about eternal life anymore. Yes, it gives eternal life, but it gives more than that. It gives life here. And when you're obedient to God, you have a happy, holy, wonderful marriage. And when you're obedient to God, you've got happy, holy, wonderful children. They're not perfect, and your spouse isn't perfect. But it can be wonderful and happy if you'll be obedient to God. And God provides for you within the culture in which you live what's appropriate for you as you serve Him, as you obey Him. And God has richly blessed us here, my family. We spent almost every dollar we had to plant this church, almost everything we had. And God has repaid us many times over, just in blessing after blessing. And there have been so many of them. There was a day when I'd given my car away. We were living in Indiana. A year before we moved here, I gave my car away. Do you realize within a few years, I had received 3 cars in return? 3. People just said, here, you need a car? Here's a car. Here, take my car. It was just incredible what God was doing and just restoring to us more than we had given to Him. And that's what God does. You see, this is the blessing. Yes, sin wrecks things, but as you go back over that ground that's been wrecked by sin, and the weeping is there because you can see all the destruction that sin brought, as you are being obedient to God and you're planting the seeds of the Spirit, you find a crop growing in your life that's spiritual and it's alive. And now all of those things that were dead are alive again. And your marriage is alive again. And your children follow Christ again. And there's the joy again in your life. All of those things are compounding upon themselves. God blesses you even in your finances. And it may not be in a way that you get the biggest house in town. It may not be like that. But God blesses you in a way that you can say, blessed be the Lord. Many years ago, it's one of my wife's favorite songs. She used to sing it all the time. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. You know that song. Do you know how it was written? There was an older couple. The guy had been in ministry his whole life, didn't have much. And he and his wife ended up in a retirement home. And if I remember the story right, they're sharing a room with another couple. I mean, that's awkward and weird. And here comes a Christian person, a Christian lady, I believe, into the room and looking around, and it's not really overly very nice, but it was nice for them. That's how they saw it. It's nice for us. They were so happy. And actually, the lady's looking at this going, you can't be happy here. There's no way. It's not very nice. And asked the wife, how is it you're so happy? And they were a joyful couple. And she said, well, I've always thought that if his eye was on the sparrow, I know he watches me. Well, then that lady went back and wrote a hymn, wrote a poem, became our gospel song. Why do I feel discouraged? Right? Why do the shadows come? Why does my heart feel lonely and long for heaven and home? When Jesus is my portion, is that how it goes? I can't remember the next line. My constant friend. His eye is on the sparrow. He's watching me. Men and women, that's what grace brings. It brings life. Where there was death, where there was destruction, you bear the precious seeds that God has preserved for you, and you plant them, and you bring forth a harvest and a bounty. And while that's talking about a physical harvest and a physical bounty, yes, we can say, look what God has done for us. Where there was death, he brings life. The wages of sin is death. It's horrible. But the gift of God, the grace of God, is life. Let's pray. Lord, we ask you to please help us now to reflect upon these truths from your word. Thank you, Lord Jesus, for what you have done. In our lives, we who believe in